system of the circulatory system. We're going to take a quick look at the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins and their structure. A lot of this is anatomical review, but I am going to revisit some of this based with an eye toward function. The arteries, of course, are the largest structure. They are fairly muscular. Some of them are, the muscular arterioles. You can see this layer of muscle in here, these smooth muscles. The endothelial layer is in the center there. And the outer layer contains some strong connective fibers to give strength to these arteries. Now the elastic arteries have an internal elastic membrane, which is really crucial. We find these elastic arteries in places such as the aorta, where they need to expand to accommodate the high pressure of ventricle ejection. And then once they expand, they will retract or recoil to generate additional pressure. And so we actually refer to these as the pressure reservoir. And that's a phrase that I want you to know. Whoops, I didn't mean to cross that out. But anyway, that's a phrase I want you to know, is this pressure reservoir phrase. When I refer to this, let's try the highlighter instead. That looks a lot nicer. Okay. This pressure reservoir, what I want you to know is that the ventricle pushes this blood into the aorta, which expands. When the ventricle enters into diastole, that's when the aorta recoils, and it actually acts as a second pump in addition to the ventricle to shoot the blood forward through the circulatory system. As we move down in size, we hit the arterioles, and this is the site where we see the greatest amount of resistance to flow. And we talked a little bit about that resistance and flow, and so just to remind you briefly, if blood flow is represented by the symbol F, then blood flow is proportional. That little fish-like symbol represents proportional, and it's proportional to delta P, which stands for change in pressure, over capital R, which is my resistance. And so that R reduces blood flow, and capital P is the pressure driving it. And then also as a reminder, my R is equal to 1 divided by the radius of my blood vessel diameter to the 4th power. So very small changes in diameter will cause large changes in my resistance. Okay. And so this is found in the arterioles, and in fact we sometimes call this the site of variable. Okay, let's see if I can spell that, variable, so that you can actually read it. Variable resistance. I'm just going to put a capital R for the resistance. And the reason for that is these smooth muscle cells can contract or relax to cause vasodilation or vasoconstriction, and that change will change my resistance, and so we get the greatest changes here within the arterioles. That's not to say that these other blood vessels can't and won't do it. They do. Veins, for example, have some smooth muscles and will change resistance. But by and large, most of that comes from the arterioles. Then we have our microcirculation, which primarily involves these capillary networks or beds. The arterioles shown here, covered in smooth muscle, can be constricted or dilated to control blood flow. So as they dilate, flow goes up, and we get more flow into our capillary beds. As they constrict, flow goes down, and we get less flow into our capillary beds. Additionally, we have these pre-capillary sphincters, which are these rings of smooth muscles prior to the capillaries, which again can control capillary flow into the capillary bed. Now these capillaries will of course diverge significantly. Diverge means to branch, only then to converge into the venules. So that's the strategy there. Capillaries are very thin, and so this is the site of exchange with the tissues, and we're going to look at that in detail. Okay, so this is the site of the exchange with the tissues, exchange of oxygen, exchange of carbon dioxide, exchange of glucose, and other nutrients, and so forth. These are our very smallest blood vessels. They can be 7 to 10 micrometers in diameter. By the way, a red blood cell is also about 7 micrometers in diameter. And so that is interesting because that means that these red blood cells have to squeeze through those capillaries single file. So this is going to say size of red blood cells about 7 micrometers in diameter. Okay. And they have this simple layer of endothelial cells, this squamous epithelium, this very thin endothelial layer, and that's all there is to it. It's just a single layer of endothelial cells. Unlike the arterioles, which then are surrounded with smooth muscles, or the arteries, which have that muscular layer and or the elastic layer, these just have this epithelial cells, the endothelial cells. And so that's where we see that exchange occurring. Now, I already mentioned this, so just kind of emphasis again, arterioles and the precapillary sphincters control the blood flow. And that again fits into, you got to know and love this equation. This flow is proportional, and it's okay for you to substitute an equal sign if you want. I prefer the proportional because it's not exactly equal, because we've got to factor in other things like temperature and viscosity and what have you, but close enough. And so can change that radius, then you're going to change the flow. And generally, if we change the radius in the arteries, the heart will compensate by generating more pressure. But if we change the radius out here in the arterioles, we're far enough away from the heart that we really don't see compensation. And so that we don't necessarily see that increase in pressure, although there will be some. And but primarily that radius has a big effect on that flow. Now, capillaries are, all of them, thin layer of cells, and this section where they connect, these junctions right here, these are leaky, okay, and they allow for the movement of fluid into and out of the capillaries, and with that fluid comes these dissolved particles. Now, in the typical capillary that we see, these continuous capillaries, you can see this border right here. This is the view from the side, and it's decent in size, certainly big enough for water to get through, but it's not huge. Okay, we're dealing with very small molecules passing through that junction there, and slowly moving through that. But in some areas of the body we have what's called these fenestrated capillaries, where you can actually see these pores here. You can kind of look at these pores, and what these are is just additional spaces. You can see here and here and here, and these additional spaces allow for the movement of fluid more easily through those fenestrated capillaries. And so of course that's going to involve H2O, but it'll also involve other solutes that are involved in H2O, such as glucose, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and so forth. And so these things can pass through these fenestrated capillaries. And so for fenestrated capillaries, we tend to get something that I'm going to refer to as bulk flow, which is essentially movement of reasonably large volumes, and I should say relative. I mean, we're still dealing with capillaries. It's not like I have an open valve here with massive amounts of blood pouring through, but we do have the movement of a large amount of fluid here. And so we find these fenestrated capillaries in areas like the kidneys, which are necessary for filtration, and those fenestrations play a part in that. Intestines, where we need a lot of absorption, and then endocrine glands, where we really need to be moving those hormones in and out. And so we can find those in those areas. We have some capillaries that kind of have characteristics of both that are in between, but loosely speaking, these are the two major types. Now here we're going to look at our veins and really relate this back to this venous return I've been talking about. Okay, now the veins are interesting. They contain most of the blood in the circulatory system, and they are capable of expanding. We call these the volume reservoirs because they expand fairly easily to accommodate large volumes of blood. And the pressure in the veins is very low. We can, the vena cava, for example, is approximately 4, 5, 6 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure, which is just not very much. Further in our legs and so forth, we might be dealing with slightly higher pressures, but it's still very low, which means the blood is kind of just creeping through the brains nice and sluggishly, and it has a tendency to pool in some of these areas where the veins expand, and just very slowly makes its way back to the heart. And so a lot of the blood will just remain in the veins. And so if you're on an airplane, for example, and you're sitting there for long hours on your plane, your blood is essentially pooling in your calves. And so we are going to be at risk of these deep vein thromboses because primarily that blood is just kind of lingering in these veins, and it just stores this blood. And so when I talk about this, when I talk to the cardiovascular system, sometimes what I do is I draw this like it's a storage room. That's a little bit of an oversimplification. It's not like the blood just goes into storage and stays there forever, but it still can, functionally speaking, kind of just allow that blood to pool and hold on and not make its way back to the heart very quickly. And so it's going to store that blood. So then the question is, so if most of our blood is in the veins, and we want to get it into the arteries so that we can pump it through the rest of circulation, how do we get there? Well, that's going to involve what we call the skeletal muscle pump and the valves that are present in the veins. And so skeletal muscle pump, pretty straightforward. When we exercise, when we start moving, as the muscles contract, they tend to shorten but also thicken. And consequently what they do is they push against those veins and they squish them. And so that's like squishing this blood back out of the storage into circulation to be returned to the heart. Now, this pressure would cause the blood to move in all directions, up and down. But we don't really want backward flow. We want to move toward the heart, right? Here's my to heart. We don't want to go opposite of that. And so fortunately, we've got these one-way valves which prevent the backward flow. So when our muscles contract, we squish the blood upward, and then those valves close behind that blood when our muscles relax. And so we get this steady, how but slow, movement back to the heart. Now we can also include the rise and fall of our thoracic cavity with this, and in your textbook it will actually list that respiratory effect as being this separate pump. But the respiratory muscles are in fact skeletal muscles, so at least for me, I group them together into one category. And that brings us back to our venous return idea, is when I switch my pressure, when I change the pressure in my veins with those skeletal muscle pumps, then I actually push that blood back to the heart. And by pushing the blood back to the heart, I get an increase in that end diastolic volume, and my return, and in return I get an increase in ventricle stretch and an increase in cardiac output. A couple other vocabulary words: capacitance vessels. That simply means that under normal conditions 2/3 of our blood are hanging out in the veins, and you can actually see that here where you've got your small veins and your venules. That's a tremendous amount. Your large veins, a tremendous amount there, 2/3 there. But when we activate that venous return, we push some of that back to the heart and then therefore back into the arteries. And so another way of saying this is we change the distribution of the veins. Change the distribution of the blood. This last slide is going to look at how those pressures are regulated. And so you can see this venous return and my skeletal muscle pump. Now, I didn't mention this specifically, but I do want to talk about my veins. They do have some smooth muscle there. And so when the veins, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it will cause venoconstriction. Now, this is not as dramatic as what occurs with the arterioles, but it's still enough to increase the pressure, which will increase venous return, which will increase end diastolic volume, which in turn increases my cardiac output, right? Increases my ventricle stretch and so forth. Here's the thoracic pump that I mentioned, and as I said, I tend to group this as being part of my skeletal muscle pump. At least that's how it works in my head. But as I mentioned, some of your textbooks, including our textbook, will have it as a separate factor. And then the last part of this venous return is blood volume, and this is really, for the most part, the job of the kidneys and the digestive system. I'll point out both of those. So digestive system would be to take in that fluid. The renal system controls how much of our urine we're going to produce. And again, here we're using these dotted lines to represent inhibition, but my preference is to use my standard symbol, which is, oops, sorry, so messy, is like so. It doesn't matter so much really what symbol you use, as long as you know what the symbol means, and so forth. Now, tissue fluid volume refers to cell fluid, and of course as the cells swell up, that removes fluid from the blood.